It wasn't just a dogfight. It was a mechanical execution. Imagine a 3-ton masterpiece of British engineering, a machine built to outrun bullets and outclimb the Luftwaffe, suddenly turning into a falling stone. There is no smoke. There is no fire. There is only a sudden, terrifying silence as the engine chokes on the very air it needs to breathe. How did the British Empire's greatest shield manage to collapse just by climbing into the clouds? Why did a system built to survive the fires of war surrender to a single microscopic crystal of ice? But that was a lie. The generals in London called it a mystery of physics. They were looking at the sky, but they should have been looking at a drafty factory floor in Ontario. The only person who saw the disaster coming was Elsie MacGill, a woman the military establishment mocked because she was just a female engineer, a woman who couldn't even stand without the help of 2 maple wood canes. They laughed at her warnings because the manual said the plane was perfect. Then the engines started to fail. Why did the world's most powerful air force ignore the only tactic that could save them? The answer wasn't in the classified vaults, but in the hands of the underdog. January 1940, Fort William, Ontario. The world is at war, but here, the primary enemy isn't the Third Reich. It is the atmosphere itself. In the shadow of the Sibley Peninsula, the air doesn't just bite, it carves. At 40 degrees below zero, the very nature of matter begins to change. Rubber becomes as brittle as peppermint bark. Lubricating oil, the lifeblood of any engine, thickens into a stubborn, black sludge. On the tarmac of the Canadian Car and Foundry, the Hawker Hurricane looks like a predator out of time. This is the plane that will win the Battle of Britain. It is rugged, thick-boned, and draped in doped linen, a masterpiece of 1930s engineering. But as the winter sun hangs low and weak over Lake Superior, these machines are not roaring. They are gasping. The British Air Ministry has sent the blueprints across the Atlantic with the expectation of a colonial miracle. They need thousands of these fighters to plug the holes in the sky over London. But they sent a design perfected for the mild, damp summers of Kent and Sussex. They sent a machine that assumes the air will always be kind. Up in the cockpit of a test flight, a pilot feels the vibrations first. It starts in his boots, a rhythmic, uneven shudder. He pushes the throttle forward, demanding the full authority of the 12-cylinder Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The input is a simple mechanical command for power. But inside the fatal flaw of the engine, physics has declared a strike. As the plane climbs into the thinning, freezing air, the pressure inside the carburetor drops. This drop in pressure causes an instantaneous flash freeze of the moisture in the intake. It is a phenomenon called refrigeration icing. In seconds, a jagged wall of ice chokes the throat of the engine. The engine isn't broken, it's being strangled. The air-to-fuel ratio vanishes, the spark plugs foul with unburnt gasoline, and the Merlin simply stops. The output is a sudden, deafening silence, followed by the terrifying whistle of a 3-ton glider falling toward the pines. Back in London, the technical reports are met with a crystallized arrogance. The official stance is one of dismissive tradition. One high-ranking official is heard to remark, "The Hurricane is a thoroughbred. One does not put a winter coat on a racehorse simply because the stable is drafty. If the Canadians cannot fly them, perhaps the fault lies with the pilots, not the blueprints." They prioritize the manual over the reality of the Canadian wilderness. They believe the system is perfect because the tradition of British engineering says it must be. But while the establishment screams into their telephones and ignores the mounting pile of wreckage in the Ontario brush, a different sound echoes through the factory floor at can car. Thump, click, thump, click. The sound is rhythmic, slow, and heavy. It is the sound of two maple wood canes striking the concrete. Elsie MacGill moves through the hangar with a measured, agonizing grace. A decade ago, on the eve of her graduation as the first woman in Canada to hold an aeronautical engineering degree, polio had struck. It took her legs, but it failed to touch the machinery of her mind. Now, at 35, she is the chief aeronautical engineer, and she is the only person in the room who truly understands the deadly gap. She doesn't look at the hurricane as a symbol of national pride. She doesn't see a thoroughbred. She sees a series of thermal vulnerabilities. She watches the male mechanics struggle to start the engines, their blowtorches flickering uselessly against the sub-zero wind. She sees the wings, once sleek, now jagged with hoarfrost that destroys the very physics of lift. She is the ghost in the machine, moving through the shadows of the factory, ignored by the visiting dignitaries who assume she is perhaps a clerk or a remarkably persistent secretary. In the quiet hours, when the factory is a cathedral of cold steel, Elsie sits in her wheelchair, her canes leaning against the fuselage. She isn't reading the British manuals. She is rewriting them. She recognizes the human paradox. The system has built a weapon of incredible power, but they have forgotten that the weapon must breathe. She begins to sketch a radical departure from the sacred blueprints. She envisions high-pressure de-icing fluid lines, heated air intakes diverted from the exhaust, and most controversially, the addition of skis. The men in the boardroom scoff. They call her ideas unnecessary weight. They treat her presence as a novelty, a wartime eccentricity. But Elsie knows something they don't. She knows that the cold is coming for everyone. It isn't just a Canadian problem. Soon the war will move to the high-altitude corridors of the Eastern Front and the Arctic convoys. She is already in the dark, holding the silence that will eventually save them. She is prepared for the moment when the laughter stops and the generals realize that their perfect machine is nothing more than a very expensive lawn ornament. The hubris of the empire has met the hammer of the northern winter. The British believe they have sent a savior to Canada. They don't realize that they have actually sent a victim. And the only person who can perform the resurrection is a woman who isn't even supposed to be in the hangar. November 1940. A windswept airfield in northern Canada. The war is no longer a distant rumble over the English Channel. It has become a hungry beast, demanding metal, oil, and blood. But in the boardrooms of the Canadian aviation industry, the atmosphere is thick with a different kind of tension. They call it the novelty. Elsie MacGill stands, or rather leans, at the head of a mahogany table. Around her sit men in tailored suits and military uniforms, their faces etched with a condescending patience. They see a woman with steel braces on her legs and two canes in her hands. They see a lady engineer who should be designing kitchen appliances, not the machines that will decide the fate of Western civilization. The blueprints are sacred, One representative of the Air Ministry says, his voice dripping with the crystallized arrogance of a man who hasn't felt the wind at 40 below. You are suggesting we add weight. You are suggesting we alter the aerodynamic profile of the Hurricane with skis? This is a fighter plane, Miss MacGill, not a bobsled. He scoffs, looking at his colleagues for approval. He treats the Arctic winter as a minor inconvenience, a budget line item. But he has fatally underestimated the opponent. He believes the enemy is the Luftwaffe. He doesn't realize the enemy is the very physics of the North. While he toasts to British tradition, a cold front, the true master of the high altitudes, is preparing to remind him that a perfect plane is useless if it cannot leave the ground. Elsie doesn't argue. She doesn't have to. She has already spent her nights in the hangar, crawling into the cockpits on her hands and knees. She has felt the frozen grease that locks the control columns. She has seen the blind spot in the design. A machine built for the gentle mists of London cannot survive the razor-edged ice of the Siberian corridors. Physics, she says, her voice calm and forensic, does not care about tradition. It only cares about survival. She orchestrates a radical, unsanctioned redesign. While the official channels are clogged with paperwork, Elsie is on the factory floor, managing a workforce of thousands. She is a conductor leading a symphony of steel. She replaces the standard landing gear with specialized retractable skis. She installs revolutionary de-icing systems, tubing that carries heated fluids to the leading edges of the wings, preventing the ice from ever gaining a foothold. She designs a winterized cowling for the engine, a mechanical scarf that keeps the Merlin's throat warm enough to breathe. To the men in London, this is heresy. To the pilots who have to fly these machines, it is a miracle. But Elsie doesn't just design, she tests. There is a moment that becomes legend in the factory. A test flight is scheduled for the first winterized Hurricane. The male pilots are hesitant. The modifications look strange. The skis are bulky, the new intakes unfamiliar. Elsie MacGill, the woman who cannot walk across a room without help, demands to be in the plane. She isn't a pilot, her legs won't allow it, but she is the engineer. She crawls into the observer's seat, her brilliant mind compensating for the body that polio tried to break. As the Hurricane thunders down the snow-packed runway, the skis kick up a spray of white powder. The plane lifts. It doesn't just fly, it thrives. In the sub-zero air, where other engines would be coughing their last breath, Elsie's Hurricane roars. She has taught the machine how to live in the ice. This is the cognitive bridge. Because Elsie lived a life of physical limitation, she understood the necessity of adaptation. The experts saw a perfect system. The underdog saw a system that needed crutches. She gave the Hurricane her own strength. Yet, even as the Maple Leaf Hurricanes begin to roll off the assembly line at a rate of 3 per day, the system pushes back. The media begins to catch wind of her story. They don't call her a master of engineering. They call her the Queen of the Hurricanes. They turn her into a comic book character, a pin-up girl for the war effort. They flatten her genius into a Yinkeiru novelty. The directors of the factory, jealous of her growing fame and embarrassed that a woman is the one solving their technical failures, begin to tighten the leash. They dismiss her warnings about production bottlenecks. They treat her as a mascot rather than a leader. "She's done her part," they whisper in the hallways. Now let the men handle the real business of war. But the real business of war is about to change. The Nazis have launched Operation Barbarossa. The fight is moving into the deepest, deadliest winter in human history. The experts in London are suddenly receiving desperate telegrams from the Soviet front. Their hurricanes are seizing. Their pilots are dying on the runways. The hubris of the establishment is about to meet the hammer of reality. They ignored the lady with the canes. Now they have to beg her for the secret to survival. While the generals are drowning in the panic of their own making, Elsie is already in the hangar, watching the sunset over the frozen lake. She isn't celebrating. She is looking at the next set of blueprints. She knows that the deadly gap never stays closed for long. She had already found the silence that would save them. Now, she just had to wait for the world to realize they were drowning in the ice. 15 May 1942. The high-altitude corridors over the Eastern Front. The sky here isn't blue. It is a pale, freezing void. At 30,000 feet, the air is so thin and cold, it feels like inhaling needles. Below, the German Wehrmacht is learning a lesson in hubris, their panzers frozen in the mud, their logistics shattered by a winter they were told would never come. But above them, the maple leaf hurricanes are doing the impossible. While the standard German Bf 109s struggle with frozen fuel lines and brittle gaskets, the winterized hurricanes sweep through the frost. They dominate the winter skies not because they are faster, but because they are the only machines that are truly awake. Elsie MacGill's crutches, the skis, the heated intakes, the specialized fluid lines have turned a summer fighter into an Arctic predator. This is the climax of her vision, the visceral peak of a struggle that began on a factory floor in Ontario. The pilots don't know her name. They don't know about the woman who crawled through the cockpits on her hands and knees. They only know that when they thumb the starter in the heart of a Russian blizzard, the Merlin engine roars to life. But history is rarely kind to its architects. As the tide of the war begins to turn, a cruel irony begins to take shape. The very system that Elsie saved is preparing to discard her. The Queen of the Hurricanes, the comic book, is still on the newsstands, but in the boardroom of Canadian Car and Foundry, the atmosphere has turned glacial. The war is winding down, and the men who were once desperate for her genius now find it inconvenient. The novelty has worn off. They no longer need a conductor for their symphony of steel. They want a return to normalcy. And in 1940s normalcy, a woman does not run a factory of several thousand men. The micro scene of her exit is not a grand explosion, but a quiet, clinical betrayal. A representative of the board sits across from her, the same type of man who once scoffed at her skis. "We appreciate everything you've done, Elsie," he says, not looking her in the eye. "But with the contracts shifting, we feel a more traditional leadership is required for the post-war transition." He offers a solution that is really a dismissal. He prioritizes tradition over the truth of her impact. Elsie doesn't plead. She doesn't fight for a seat at a table that no longer wants her. She simply reaches for her maplewood canes, stands with that same measured, agonizing grace, and walks out of the hangar she built. The bittersweet victory is this: she saved the hurricane, she saved the pilots, and in doing so, she helped save the world. But the world in its haste to return to the status quo, would choose to remember the roar of the engine and forget the woman who taught it how to breathe. By the late 1940s, the narrative of the Queen of the Hurricanes is flattened. The history books focus on the Spitfire pilots and the generals in the bunkers. Elsie MacGill is pushed into the footnotes, her technical genius obscured by the rising tide of post-war domesticity. They wanted her to be a mascot, a girl in a comic book, not the chief aeronautical engineer who rewrote the laws of survival. But the modern echo remains. Do we not see this same hubris today? We build massive, complex systems, digital infrastructures, global supply chains, energy grids, and we assume they are perfect because the manual says so. We ignore the deadly gap until the environment changes, until the ice of a new crisis begins to choke the intake. We still look for the thoroughbred and ignore the underdog with the crutches. We still prioritize the standard procedure over the human spirit that sees the failure before it happens. Elsie MacGill's story is a mirror. It asks us, who are the invisible agents of change we are ignoring right now? Whose warnings are we dismissing as unnecessary weight? We remember the steel. We remember the hurricane. But the true legacy isn't the plane. It's the realization that when the system fails, the only thing that can save us is the individual who isn't afraid to look at a masterpiece and see its flaws. The Queen of the Hurricanes didn't just build a plane. She taught us that survival is an act of defiance. And though the history books may try to bury her under the noise of the engines, the frost on the wings will always remember her name. If you believe that stories like Elsie MacGill's deserve to be remembered, join our ranks by subscribing and liking this video. It is through your support that these voices are brought back from the silence. We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.